Okay, so we are recording. So welcome to the Digital Humanities Lab here in University College Cork. I've said a little bit about the room. It's a multi-purpose teaching room designed for student-centered teaching and learning. We have our little nook behind us. We have our group work booths over there. We have our digitization lab behind the windows. It's a very nice place. Hopefully, some of you will get to come and see it in due course. But what I want to do today is talk about what I've done in game design as an assessment tool. So I've broken this as a slight introduction. There's 4 case studies of specific courses and how we assess them. And then there's some reflections on the end on future challenges. And I hope to get through this in about 40 minutes and then take questions and discussion afterwards, if that's okay. If you think of a question while I'm talking, pop it in the chat so that you don't forget it. So this is the description that I originally wrote, which more or less relates to what I'm going to cover today, talking about why it's a useful assessment tool, look at the process that I worked through in some of my classes, and also talk about how this aligns with assessment. These slides, I had a version of them, and then after our discussions in Rome at the working group meeting last weekend, I more or less threw them out and redesigned the structure to make it more organized. So, the first point in terms of introduction is that I'm a gamer. And I have played a lot of games over the years, and writing this down here actually is a little scary. Historical miniatures war games for nearly 50 years, and board and counter also for nearly 50 years, computer war games from about 1982, and Dungeons and Dragons for 36 years, and various other tabletop role-playing games. So I guess one of the points is that it is difficult for people who do not play games to work out how to integrate them into teaching and learning, I think. I think it's becoming easier. I think there's a distinct profile between older and younger people. Younger educators are more game savvy and game literate. And I think we're going to shed some more evidence on that with a survey that we're going to do shortly. But it is definitely, it's one of these things that you need to know how to make them work and how they work, and you need to pick games and mechanics that you're familiar with. And I have found that the students who are game literate do better, adapt to this. When I started in about 2008 using game-based assessments, I was, again, everybody in my department, it was a normal humanities department at the time, everybody assessed everything by essay. So as you know, if you've worked in that environment, if you have 400 students doing a course on the origins of the French Revolution and you set an essay saying discuss or evaluate or consider the historiography or whatever way you word it, 400 students are going to see the words French Revolution and they're going to write 400 versions of the same thing. The title defines the answer. And the answer, to a certain extent, there is usually a consensus in the literature, and it's a topic you have covered, probably in lectures. It's very difficult to get away with setting essays on topics that you haven't actually covered. I've managed to do it once or twice, but you have to warn the students ahead of time. And of course, the situation we have now is that large language models, so-called AI, can fake a fairly plausible C or B grade humanities essay answer. So we're increasingly looking for forms of assessment that break out of that mold. So to a certain extent, playing games, it allows you to look at the range of possible counterfactuals, not just what happened, but what might have happened. The title question, of course, on the slide, where is Grouchy, relates to the Battle of Waterloo. On the morning of Waterloo, Napoleon did not know where the Third Corps were they going to turn up, what time were they going to turn up, were they going to prevent the Prussians arriving. So if you ask students to write an essay about the Battle of Waterloo, they know all this, it's in the books. But if you ask them to design a game on a battle, they have to think of all the possibilities that are realistically plausible. And they have to make a judgment. What is realistically plausible here that we can put in the game? And what is unreasonable or just beyond the bounds of possibility? So you're thinking about, as Patrick Rail says there, looking at historical thinking, at historical methods, historical skills, and you could substitute humanities for history there in terms of all of this. It also requires students to break the issue into components. Take a problem and break it down into all of its component parts, which is, something that's useful for work and task breakdown and project breakdown. Things that we're going to talk about as we go through this, I'm going to identify, students have to identify relationships between parts of the problem, work out how you quantify those relationships, how you analyze real world problems and break them down. So it's a very different sort of assessment task to just going to the library, picking 3 books off the book list and writing a summary of them, which unfortunately, that's what many students do for their essays. And it doesn't require a great depth of understanding. They can do it. It's a mechanical process going down the road of Hayden White and Richard Rorty, this argument that history is just a collection of tropes. They can mimic the tropes of the discipline. Which is, of course, what large language models do as well, although they don't intend to. So the earliest course that I started applying game-based learning in was a course called War, State and Society. War, State and Society since 1450. I started doing the game-based stuff in 2008, but I'd already been teaching the course since about 2000. So I knew the material. And again, this is important. You really need to know what's the content before you can work out how it will work. It was an undergraduate survey course. It was an option at about 80 students every year. And it covered a time period from the Gunpowder Revolution, so about 1450. Key dates for the start of the Gunpowder Revolution, the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The Battle of Castillon, also in 1453, which is the first use of gunpowder artillery on the battlefield. For successful use, up to World War I. So this is defined in military history as the age of battles. The problem in the battles for that period is, how did leaders learn to make the best use of technology on the battlefield? Gunpowder, basically. So it's a long period of transition, and there's a clear through line running through it. And it also provides you with simple constrained problems. You have a big list of battles, not all of which had been the subject of war games, commercial war games. So there was a lot of options there to produce lists of things for the students to do that they could not find elsewhere. And they were constrained problems because it was one battle, one day that happened in a confined space with a limited number of troops. So the exercise it was a midterm, so it only counted for 20% of the overall mark, and it was done in groups to make it easier to overcome problems. And the exercise was to design a 1-page war game. Now, what is a war game? So wargaming gets serious around 1824 with von Muffling's Kriegspiel. Which it's an innovation that happened at a time that was ripe for it. Prior to the French Revolution, armies were quite small, 40 to 50,000. The French Revolution changes that. Prior to the French Revolution, small armies, you could march them all down one road. If you assemble them for battle, they could take a mile or two of a frontage. The commander could see everything. He could see the entire army and control them from a single command post. The French Revolution changes that with the levée en masse. Conscription, suddenly armies go up to as many as 250,000. And you cannot keep them all together. You cannot move them down one road. They've got to move down multiple routes in parallel. The army, large parts of it are out of sight of the commander. So you have to manage a distributed force over a much larger area of territory. And several things facilitate that. One was that most of Western Europe was reasonably well mapped, adequately mapped to control armies by map. And it also means then you have to rely on written orders and a general staff. So this is around the same time that staff colleges are first set up. West Point was the first, Saint-Cyr in France, Sandhurst in the UK. And you get a system. And how that system works is that, every evening the different elements of, let's say, the French Grande Armée, 5 or 6 army corps, each 20, 30, 40,000 men, reach their bivouac for the evening. They write a report. The report goes back in the early part of the night to Napoleon's headquarters, where his chief of staff has laid out the maps for the region. And as the reports come in, the position of the troops are marked on them. Middle of the night, Napoleon gets up, looks at the maps, dictates the orders for the following morning, and they're sent back out to the commanders. Hopefully, he will try and effect a concentration at a particular point in time with numerical supremacy and can achieve a victory. And that's how he achieved most of his significant victories. So for that, the Kriegspiel, which is essentially a map-based war game, was a perfect model of the sort of general staff management of warfare from that period onwards. And it was taken up in the 19th century and translated into English and French and went to America, and different armies took up models of this, and particularly with the success of the Prussians in the German wars of unification. Almost every other European power assumed, correctly possibly, that the use of the Kriegspiel as a training tool was a key element in the success of the Germans. So it was taken up to a varying degree in professional military education across the world. After World War II, there was a boom in commercial war games, commercial hobby war games. So these were board games. Very often the map was just produced on paper rather than board, with a grid laid over it, hex grid, to represent and control movement over the space in time, and counters representing the units. So in the early parts of this, these were the systems were quite simple. So these counters for a Waterloo game have two numbers. One is for movement, which represents, based on historic march rates, how far a unit could move in about an hour, which is a game turn. And they have another number, which is mostly based on their strength, the head count, which represents their combat strength, with some slight adjustment for really good or really poor units, but it's mostly very simple kinetic stuff. The side with the mostest wins. And there's a combat results table based on the odds, the relative strength of attacker and defender, and you roll a dice, one 6-sided dice, which math people will realize is in fact a statistical tool with increments of 16.6%. So it is actually, the combat results table is actually tied to statistics which are based on historical casualty rates and results. So this is a very simple genre of war game. Over the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of these were produced, mostly focusing on the big name battles. And at the time, there was a number. Jim Dunnigan, who's a famous war game designer, argued that it was like a paper computer, suggested that 99% of people don't understand war games, which was possibly true at the time, and which is why I need to explain it just in case. I think that number has changed. People in general these days are much quicker to understand complexity. And the other argument he made, which is relevant to what I do in the digital humanities, is that if you could handle manual war games, if you could understand how to put them together, you could program a computer, because the two, he described them as paper computers. So that's what it is. And therefore, what I ask the students to do, people may want to come back with questions about war games. I can talk for hours about those. Back to the one-page war game assignment. So it was to pick a battle from the Age of Battles, one-day battle, one battle, reasonably sized armies, under 50,000, reasonably compact battlefield, which is true of most of the battles of that period, and to represent that on one page with up to 50 counters. So they were allowed to use the basic combat system from the Napoleon and Waterloo game, which I can explain to students in about 15 minutes to a level where they can play it. So that's, again, class time. How much time is it going to take to explain this? Will most of the students understand that this is a key issue? So there's a couple of those there, which is actually from the front page of a conference paper I did in 2008. One of those is Rossbach, which is kind of fallen off the image. The other is Gettysburg, in a terrible color scheme for the map, but I don't grade on graphics. So they've got the map for the first day of Gettysburg on the top half, and they've got the counters for the Union and Confederate units. So you can cut the counters out, and they have rules were on the back, and it all fits in one page, and was very nice. And what this group did, like many others, was they looked at some things that happened on the first day of Gettysburg, and they said, why did this happen like this? So they looked at the failure to perform from certain Confederate units and looked at the command structure and discovered where the problem was. It was a particular commander who suffered from dyspepsia, a tummy ailment. And when that acted up, he was not very functional. Therefore, the units under his command underperformed. So they wrote a rule to reflect the likelihood that he would have an off day, as he did. They wrote other rules for the, famously at Gettysburg, Jeb Stuart's cavalry never showed up. He was that kind of character. He was entirely unreliable as a commander. So, they wrote a random rule and created the counters. What is the possibility that he will actually show up where he's needed? So they considered all of these possibilities, and, that was perfect. For, I suppose, 7 or 8 years, I ran this and got about a dozen every year. Group projects. Group, because if you make it a solo project and someone gets stuck and cannot understand how to do part of it, they're stuck. Whereas if you have a group of people, it increases the possibility that somebody will figure out how to get past the problem. So it turned out to be in many respects, I was trying to make this as safe as possible and as low risk as possible, and to scaffold it against the possibility that some group would have a complete failure to produce this. And it turned out I was overcautious, and it worked fine. No group had a major problem over the course of the years when I was teaching that course. I have some, but not all of the games saved. They're playable, they're interesting. So it worked. But how did I assess it? So this is, again, a variation on something that I wrote back in 2008. So Bloom's taxonomy, this is the revised version from 2001, which is much improved over the original. And it is, of course, behind a great deal of how we're expected to write learning outcomes for everything. And they're based on Bloom's taxonomy. And it is a behaviorist approach to teaching, although you can work around that part of it, but it's difficult sometimes. But it has 6 levels. I'm sure everybody who's done anything on the scholarship of teaching and learning or been through any university course on how you teach will have met Bloom's taxonomy. So I'm taking a certain degree of understanding for granted here. But so, in an essay, your basic knowledge level is facts. Have they got the facts? Have they got sorted out which ones are significant? Have they structured them in some kind of way? And then as you go up the taxonomy to the higher levels, are they understanding how the facts relate to one another? Do they, at the highest level, in, again, history as a discipline, you're looking for examples of historical understanding and understanding how historical debates between historians work, which is a very different thing to just rolling out a list of facts and dates. For most things, for most major topics in history, historians argue about why and how they happened. And it is understanding those arguments that's really the top level of understanding. So in the war game design exercise, at the very basic levels, down at the bottom of the thing, you're really just looking for them to produce a list of the units, a map. Can they find a map and make a decision about how to represent it? Maybe they understand more about, at the higher level, the organization of the army. How do these units fit together? Then when you get into the game design part, can they choose an appropriate scale for the map and the units? And design the counters and the map to fit that. So again, No marks for graphics, but definitely for putting the numbers on stuff, deciding how to represent these things in a quantitative way, which is a hard transition. We work in narratives. We make sense of the world through narratives. Computers work on numbers. So understanding how to put numbers on things is a key challenge. And then writing rules. How do these units move? Are there special rules? How does terrain affect how they move? Different armies respond very differently to different types of terrain over the development of time. So you kind of need to know how do they fire? I mean, cavalry in the wars of religion worked very much by firepower in the 30 Years' War. They would charge in, fire their pistols, and roll back out to reload. Nobody much did shock cavalry action except the Swedes, whereas in the Napoleonic Wars, cavalry relied on shock action. In the American Civil War, cavalry didn't charge because you couldn't. Firepower was too lethal. So can they come up with appropriate rules for things like this within the time frame of the battle? And then can they weave them all together? In terms of the evaluation level of Bloom's taxonomy, can they make a complete package that works together reasonably well, gets them into the B+A territory here? And then can they write a note at the end explaining why they made these choices? Because sometimes people in designing a game will do something in the heat of the moment just because they need to fill a gap and they can't really explain why they did it. And you actually want them to be able to say, well, we decided to do this, this, and this because these are the historical reasons why we wanted to do it. So that reflective piece, showing their understanding of how the process works and how all the parts fit together, that gets an A. I got to give out a lot of A's in that course, I have to say. And I found it very, very satisfactory, and the students enjoyed it. So that was that. Right. Case study 2. International Organizations was a course which I taught, I don't know for how many years, a long time. It was an undergraduate option course in second and third year on the history of the League of Nations and the United Nations. It had about 20 students, occasionally maybe 30. And how I assessed this, almost immediately once I started teaching this course, I decided the assessment was going to be a conference game, a Model UN style conference role play game. Now, this was very different but I had to try and make the assessment slightly align in terms of workload with the normal options in the department, which was a 1,500-word midterm and a 4,000-word final. So the amount of writing they had to do had to kind of fit with that profile. Mine could not be the option with a huge workload. So what's a Model UN? For people who know this, it's students take on the role of a state or a faction in an international crisis. So this is a picture from Wikimedia Commons. It's actually, I think it's a schools Model UN in Baden-Württemberg, in Stuttgart, so it's secondary school people playing the role of the individual states in the United Nations in a crisis situation, usually. So the research requires them to look at the background of the crisis and what is the position of their state? What do the French, the Germans, the Italians, what were their views on this issue? If it was a historic one or if it was a hypothetical crisis, what was their position in similar crises? They present a negotiating position and then they have to negotiate over, it was a 2-hour class. So over two 2-hour classes, they had to negotiate towards a resolution. Now, Model UN is actually competitive. Some countries are fiercely competitive. The Dutch practically have a national team. Countries and universities send teams to international Model UNs like the Harvard or the NatMon in New York. With academic coaches. In some universities, it's credit bearing. You get academic credit for participating in Model UN. So this is all very interesting. And then there's a schools one. So, for secondary schools participating in it as well. So this is for the people who are in this. It's a big thing. If you've never seen it, and what is that? I've never heard of that. But wow, 2,000 delegates you know, at the big ones, international. The military academies compete. The Harvard and the NatMon in America, the service academies put in teams to compete in this. So, and it can get quite intense, and there's a lot of speeches, and there's rules of procedure which mimic the debate rules for international organizations, and there's considerations in it like where you get in the speakers list. For each session, you sign up to speak. Not everybody has to speak. So, you know, if you sign up too early, you get to give an early speech and the room isn't quite settled and nobody's listening to you. And if you sign up, you're too late on the speakers list, by the time you get to speak your piece, other people will have made their pitch and have established, you know, the parameters of what the resolution is going to be. So it's like competitive debating plus, plus, plus. So how did I make this work in a class? Again, this is, you know, games, you need to allocate time. It takes time over the semester. And in this case, I needed to assign the roles very early. So in week 2, people were assigned their country, or it might be a fictitious country, or it might be a faction in a hypothetical crisis. The midterm paper, which remember needs to be about 1,500 words equivalent, they were to write the initial position paper for their country or faction and circulate that. So in the last 2 sessions were the negotiation. So in the first one of those, they present their initial position and they begin bargaining. So the first hour, we'd go all around the room. The papers were circulated in writing beforehand, but they would have 5 minutes to say, well, this is what our position on this is. This is what we'd like to see happening. And then you begin bargaining and haggling. Between the first and second weeks, they were to revise their position paper and circulate a revised paper. They could negotiate by email, but they had to copy me on the emails. So that and they were allowed to use fake emails to circulate non-attributable position plans. Because this is a thing that happens in the UN. Countries that want to suggest a possible draft resolution but don't want to be identified with it, they can do a thing which I think is called a blue, if I remember correctly, and they basically produce a draft and it's just dropped anonymously on a table outside the office of each member of the Security Council. Of course, everybody knows where the draft has come from, but in theory, it's anonymous. So mechanisms like this to allow students to realistically understand how international negotiations work. And then in session 2, they present their revised position and they attempt to conclude a resolution. One of the best papers that was done in this was a student who was representing the French in a hypothetical crisis. And so he produced a paper after the first week, 1 page, a French presidential speech. All of the paper was cut and paste from existing French statements. He actually went through the French Foreign Ministry and presidential website and copied all these things. All of that was copied except 1 line at the end, where they actually slipped in the relevant suggestion that related to the crisis that we were playing out. And that was perfect because that's the way people write diplomatic documents. That's how it works. You slip some words in and everybody says, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, fine. They nodded through and then suddenly you go back and, well, you've agreed to this. So that was one of the best things that happened. The other one that happened, of course, was 1 year we had floods. Campus was flooded and was shut down during the 2 sessions, just at the start of the thing. So I told the students we would do the whole thing by email. All the negotiations would be by email. 839 pages of email, but it was great. So the final submission, they submitted their 2 negotiating papers and their final resolution with a commentary on how the negotiations went. Did they feel they'd done well? What had succeeded for them? Could they justify what they did as an authentic representation of the position of the state that they were role-playing? Could they ground their play in real world situations. Grading Model UN is difficult because there's a lot of debate. So a lot of it had to go on the written work with some allowance for people who performed very well in debate. So, I mean, you know, at the basic level, if they just had the facts of the crisis, yeah, you can pass. People do this in diplomacy. They just recite facts in speeches and recite events. And sometimes that's a very powerful thing. But really, the going up the grade scale from like a pass or a C up to an A is the strength at which they understand the relationship between the game they're playing, the simulation, and the real world. Is what they're doing in the simulation a reflection of the real world values and interests of the state that they're playing? Can they critically reflect at the very top on what they chose to do and how well it worked, so they could do better next time if we had a chance to run another one? How influential were the papers they wrote on the audience? Did they write papers that succeeded in getting their point across to the other people and winning their argument? So it's not just like writing an essay where the only person you're trying to impress is me. In this, a key criterion for success was, can you make a case which will impress the other people in the room? So that was, you know, harder to grade, but certainly I can establish and see in my mind the relationship between the different levels of performance and the sort of grades I can get. So I was able always in exam boards to justify what I'd done. Course 3 is very different. It's quite recent. And it's troubleshooting bioanalytic chemistry case studies. So this was designed for a postgrad diploma in bioanalytic chemistry. I'm not a chemist, but the course leader is. And it was designed in partnership with biopharma firms, and it was funded under a program called the Human Capital Initiative, which is a government program to address shortages in the labor force. So it produces a graduate diploma in bioanalytical chemistry. The chemistry lead is a long-time gamer, well committed to gaming, so again, knows his stuff, and is familiar with it, and wanted to introduce an element of gaming because he wanted to introduce something more realistic into the real problems, not just textbook stuff or lab stuff. He wanted to go outside the bounds of that. The format is based on the choose your own adventure game formats. Some of you will be familiar. These old game books from the 70s and 80s and 90s, which are making a comeback now. You know, things like Warlock of Firetop Mountain or stuff like that. Which you can still find in bookshops and in hobby shops. And which they have now converted some of them into digital tools. So the Lone Wolf Saga is available on mobile devices. There's various others. Fighting Fantasy is available. And the way these work is that there's the designer has created a map of the adventure. Each section is a paragraph of text. It describes the situation. You're walking down a dark road on a moonlit night and you hear a noise in the tree to the left. What do you do? Do you carry on regardless, or do you go and investigate? If you carry on, go to paragraph number 480. If you decide to investigate, you go to paragraph 23. So you can't, it's not a linear story. You have choices. The background to that slide is a map of part of, I think it's Warlock of Firetop Mountain. So it shows the different possible pathways through the adventure, through a section of it, right? The thing about this is, so it's very text orientated. It's really easy to build these. We use a tool called Twine. I can teach students how to get productive in Twine in less than 20 minutes. I've done it. So in the Twine interface, you create, each one of these is called a passage, and you create the links between them. So at every screen or passage, you have a description and you have some options. This one is from the bioanalytic chemistry course. So this is a case which was written, I think, I can't remember exactly which company wrote it. They wrote it based on a real world problem they had. And of course, before they could give it to us for use in teaching, legal had to go through it and make sure there was no proprietary corporate stuff in it. So in this particular one, I will make the PowerPoint available so you can look at this more closely. There's a description of the situation, and there's 4 options. One of those is the best option for solving the problem. The others maybe less good, maybe actually wrong. So it's very quick. It's actually a HTML page with lots of jumps in between, behind the background of it. And the editing in the Twine editor is incredibly simple, and it's a free tool, and it's a lightweight download, and it installs on every Windows and MacBook. And it's really easy to teach people how to build this. The difficult part is creating the narrative. So the industry partners provided us with 6 case studies. We workshopped those with them to refine them. The idea was to make games which were playable in about 20 minutes so that students could play several games. And then they were coded into Twine by an undergraduate in our degree program in Digital Humanities. And we've used several, our undergraduates do technology, and they do Python, and they do HTML. So this is no problem for them. But even people with no coding background use Twine to create games or interactive fiction. So the idea was that students would play at least 3 games. They didn't have to win the game. They just had to attempt 3 of the games from the library of games that we created. And they had to write a reflection on what they learned from the 3 games they played, which were real-world problems folded into a game. The grading on that, I don't have to grade it. Chemistry course team grades it, is pass-fail. The entire module is graded as a pass-fail basis. So it's a very low-risk assessment. I keep repeating this idea of low-risk assessment when you're asking students to do something that's different, so that their risk of them failing or getting into trouble trying something different is minimized. So in the second part of the course, groups of students were asked to devise a scenario for a similar game. They had to have about 20 option points in it with 3 or 4 choices for each. The grading again is pass-fail. Groups, again, to avoid the problem of one person getting stuck, a group is more likely to be able to complete. What we have found is that the more real-world work experience the students in the group have, the better the product they produce. They're not required to produce working games. They're just required to take it as far as they can, but some groups have. Many groups produce a very complete problem scenario. And so some of the groups have produced stuff which is good enough for us to code them in Twine and add them to the library of games. Some groups have even built the games in Twine because we give them a demo and show them what Twine is so they understand what's happening in the background. Again, this is a great thing about Twine because so many digital game building tools are difficult to use and the students don't know what's happening in the background and they're technically hard. Twine, you can show them and they get it. So 1 or 2 groups have just gone right ahead and built a game and said, here, we're submitting a game. And here we have this week's hot off the press example, which is, this is a 4th-year forensics student. So this is an undergraduate. And it's her final year project. She is also a gamer, as it turns out. And so the 4th-year undergraduate students were shown the postgrad projects and the postgrad games. And they were told that this was an option for their final year project if they wanted to. Most of them do conventional final year projects. This student chose to build a game. So it starts off with the crime scene, and there's 4 options there. What are you supposed to do as a crime scene investigator, apart from having, you know, fancy sunglasses and the CSI music going in the background? And you can make mistakes. So if you do the wrong one first, which in this case, the wrong choice is to create a sketch map of the crime scene. And so you click through that and it takes you to the next screen, which says, yes, you create a sketch map, but you've made a mistake here in procedure because you haven't sealed it off first. So you better go back to the start and redo it. So it took me not more than 20 minutes to show this student how to use Twine. And that's it. She all this, images, the whole thing, produced it. The most difficult part was working out the narrative. So the first part of the game is the crime scene. The second part is discussing with the supervisor what the investigator has done. Is it right? Did you do this? Did you do that? Did you do the other thing? So it's kind of self-assessed almost. And then there are 3 alternative endings based on the choices that she made during the crime scene investigation. Either you get a conviction, or you convict the wrong person, or it's thrown out of court. So it's a very good story. And the great thing about this is literally done in about a month, along with the other full spectrum of student workload. So the process here, how this worked. Obviously, we started by rolling it out in a postgrad course, professional course, students with a very professional attitude to work. We made the assessment low stakes. It's a pass-fail module. It's only one module of their whole course, so low risk there. It's run for 4 years. It works very well. And then we had a couple of papers produced out of this, and we have a book chapter coming out. So there are outputs, which are nice. This has then been demoed to final year undergraduates, and they were told, you can have a go at this if you want to. And so one produced a game, and one has produced a project which we can turn into a game because of the way it's approached and the way it's laid out. So this means we're going to start building a library of these twine games, these choose your own adventure style games, text-based with some images, which are relevant to real world cases in this case, the bachelor's degree in forensic science. And that will expand that, and we will do some research and write some papers on that. So it's a sort of slow, let's try it out in this course, then let's try it out on something that's slightly, more challenging. And eventually the whole thing will build up and become a reasonable part. One module in the postgrad diploma, one module in the bachelor's degree in forensics. So enough. Finally, this is a general overview of the stuff I do on serious games, and I'm going to speed up the pace here. Digital games, because you put numbers on things, and the digital requires you to quantify things if it's going to work in the computer. Serious games, building games to quantify things is a very legitimate activity in the digital humanities. And it helps to teach students about how real-world problems intersect with the digital. So I have had multiple options since we started the Digital Humanities program, some at MA level, some at undergrad. Some of the titles are there. So they've changed sometimes over time. Model Simulations and Games was a survey of the history of games. Principles of Game Design obviously speaks for itself. Narrative games had a focus on narrative-based games. Game user research was not a course that lasted very long because it really requires specialist equipment to make it work. And then this is gradually converging on a fairly generic serious games module at undergraduate and master's level. So, in a lot of these, one of the things I've had to do is provide an overview of the range of games that are out there. Students' gameplay existence, I've found, experience has been limited to certain types of games. And I want them to have some understanding of the broad range. And it's not gameplay, it's game design as assessment. Design a game. This is your assessment task. So I've asked them, the general product is to design concepts for 2 games. They don't have to be complete, they don't have to be perfect, but I want ideas for 2 games. So there are weekly discussion-based topics with readings and discussion prompts on the sequence of topics. There's a 7-day deadline. I like students to respond within 7 days, so we keep the pace moving. In practice, some students post very quickly, some post just before the deadline, some are falling over into the next week. So I'm moving more towards rearranging the topics towards a 14-day discussion cycle with subtopics and more interaction over the 14 days, because that seems to work better with the natural speed at which students do this. The final portfolio is all the weekly posts, 2 developed game ideas. They've been working on these in the weekly posts, so 1 or 2 pages to draw all this together, and then a short reflection on their learning. And it's really short, so that when they're in an interview for a job and somebody says, why did you do a course on serious games that's on your transcript, they can actually explain, this is what I got out of this. And that's probably the most useful part. So again, I give a certain amount of flexibility. Some of it's for the game designs, some of it's for the portfolio, which includes all the forum posts. I sometimes allow myself then a flex of 20% over and back. In the discussion, whatever marks are going for the discussion, the first couple of weeks are light. I only give 10% for the first couple of weeks because they're finding their feet and we're warming up and they're getting used to the course. And then as we go along, the middle weeks, 20% of the discussion marks, the final weeks, 30% of the discussion marks, and then an overall 40. So the marks for the discussion participation escalate as the course goes on, as the students are tackling harder material and also becoming more confident in participating in what is usually an asynchronous discussion. So I managed to merge those. I tweak the grading scheme from year to year, but those are the concepts that go in it. The sequence in almost all of these now is the introduction. I ask the students what their game topics are. There are some topics in there where I'm just telling them about things that the range of games that exist. And then the actual game building, they identify a game topic. They discuss and describe the game world. They have readings on game world building. They get some readings the next week on character building, and they're asked to define their central character in their game. Then we use the hero's journey. What is the journey of your central character through the story? Bit of Vladimir Proof's formalism goes in there as well, but that's heavy going, so we don't put too much emphasis on that. And then we look at putting numbers on things. How do you quantify these things? How do you write mechanics and maybe game user research if you can fit it in? So a kind of simpler version of this is to get them to choose a topic. You get them to identify some important things in the topic. And then for each of these, you want to identify a key event, something that's important, and express it clearly, and then work out if for this key thing, what things can influence it to make for a successful outcome and what things might lead to an unsuccessful outcome. So you're asking people, first of all, to express this in English and then to put numbers on it. So for the game board stuff and digital versions of modern games, there's lots of different game mechanics out there, but you can go a long distance with a limited number of game mechanics. So, there's tile placement and removing or replacing tiles. You put a little figure, a meeple it's called. See the meeples there in Carcassonne on the map, which signifies possession of a territory maybe, or something like that, or the ability to produce resources out of it. Placing cubes, which symbolize products, things that you've harvested, resources that you gain from that tile, maybe influence or money or time or effort that you've invested in it. Placing a building. Then you get into games with card draws and slightly more complicated where you have to build a set of something or trade cards between players. But with a very limited set of mechanics, you can build an awful lot of complicated games, and these run across many of the best-selling modern games. The matrix games thing is, again, where the players state something. This will happen, and here's the reasons why I think it'll succeed in the game. And the other players can give the counterbalancing reasons for it. And then you put numbers on it. So this is important in terms of the transition from narrative to numbers. This is Sherman Kent's language of estimative probability. You have this all the time. If you're on any sort of medicine, that leaflet in the box of medicine that you never pay any attention to? But they do clinical trials, and those trials produce statistical results. And in the leaflet, those are translated into narrative, telling you what the risk of certain side effects are. So what they're doing there is that the process of putting numbers on something in reverse. They're translating the numbers into narrative that people will grasp more readily, because people generally aren't good at statistics. In terms of estimate of probability, you're looking at something and you're saying, if we do this in the game, then it's probable, or it's about even, or maybe it won't, and you're actually putting a number on it. And that then allows you to turn it into a digital game or apply it to dice. in a board game and work out the probabilities of that. So this is the point when you bring the numbers into it, at which some people just go, numbers, can't deal with that. But most of the students, by the time I've worked them up to this, can manage to produce some kind of reasonable set of numbers. Some of them produce numbers and probabilities which are very, very odd, but we can fix that. I wanted to show you the teaching for understanding. Teaching for understanding is completely different to Bloom's taxonomy. It's a process-based framework for teaching. It focuses on generative questions, through lines, understanding goals, and different performances of understanding at different sequences. So it's very much a continuous assessment-based thing. And it does recognize, it comes out of Project Alpha in Harvard, that in the early weeks of a course, the early performance of understanding, they call it messing around. Students are just exploring the topic. And then as you go through the course, the performances of understanding become more focused until at the end, your final performance of understanding is what they call a performance of mastery, which doesn't mean chess grandmaster stuff. It means mastery of the material in the course. And it is focused on a performance rather than just an output. So it's not just a piece of writing. There can be more to it than that. So there's some definitions there of the teaching for understanding framework, which has not been taken up a lot, but it's been very core to our Centre for the Research of Teaching and Learning here, and how we explore teaching and learning. And so I've got a couple of examples. This is from sort of my game design course of what is a generative question? What are through lines that run through the whole course? What are the understanding goals that you hope them to reach at the end? And what are the different performances of understanding at the different stages? And it's a reasonably, it's easy to explain, but it's difficult for people who've been heavily committed to Bloom's learning taxonomy and learning outcomes to make the shift from an outcomes-based product to a process-based product. But this is how I approach these, and it aligns with the gradual build-up over the course from simple topics to more complicated ones. So I have another example there of a course on climate resilience. The problem for the future is all models are wrong, but some are useful. We build models. With games, we build a model of something in reality, and there are two main styles, either storytelling games or games that are a simulation. And the problem really is reconciling the two of these, particularly when we're now facing challenges in the real world that are complex. So they don't readily follow the paths of a linear narrative. And how do you therefore design game-based learning projects which will work to teach complex systems, particularly when we as people best understand the world as stories? But the world is more complex than that, and a straightforward, simple story and a game that tells a simple story does not equip people with the critical thinking paradigms necessary to understand the sort of complex real-world problems that we're facing now. So that is unfortunately the challenge, and that's going to be a very hard circle to square in future years. But that's what I'm thinking about now, how I need to lift my game on these courses in order to deal with that and make that work. So I'm very sorry I went on much longer than I said I would. And now we've got a whole stream of stuff in the chat. Oh no, that's the transcript. That's okay. Fine. That's not the chat. Here's the chat. So do we have questions in the chat, and do people want to make points? What is the typical size of the class in case study 2? That was the model UN, wasn't it? 20 to 30. That was largely determined by the size of the room I was teaching in, and also because students had to do a number of options. So the history department had a lot of options. So you had, like, second year, you would have had maybe 200 students, and they had to pick 2 or 3 options each. So it's naturally divided down. Most of the options turn out to be about 20 or 30. Some options only had 2 or 3 people in them. Some had about 80 because they were very popular. but 20-ish is about the maximum that you can do a classroom simulation like that. And that's hard work, trying to keep the discussion moving around the class. 15 would be much easier, you know. The first time I did it in a politics course, I think I had about 12, thankfully. And I don't think I ever had more than 30. And a lot of international students opted for it because they liked it. So, I mean, there is a limit, because if you're doing anything, or if you're getting students to play games, there's a limit to how much, you know, I mean, in this room here, if I was making students play a game in the course of a 2-hour session, well, I have a limited number of tables and I have a limited number of space that you can spread stuff out on. So you are really talking about, it's an interactive learning experience, all of these. So really, like any other heavily seminar style interactive course, 20 is ideal, 30 is about the max. And once you get above that, it's not impossible, but it becomes very hard. What was the other? Are there currently available courses for serious games? Well, I teach them. We may do a training school in the cost action to look at applying some of these, which is why I rearranged this sort of very long and disorganized PowerPoint into the 4 cases, in the hope that that can become a framework towards stuff. There is a lot of literature on serious games, and some of it, so it's a variable quality, and it depends on different things. But there are writing, there's conferences which deal with the European Conference on Game-Based Learning, which is in Trondheim this year, or north of Trondheim this year. Obviously, board game studies is quite specialized about board game studies, but it is serious. There is a serious games conference. There have been serious games conferences in America since about 2006. So there is stuff out there and there is literature, and it's becoming more common. The problem is that if you want to do this as an academic, you may be the only scholar in your department or in your university who wants to actually do game-based learning. So your network and your allies and your supporters may be, you know, scattered all over the world. But if you haven't done it and you want to do it, or you know, hey, my door is always open to help people, and I can dig up some readings, and I'm happy to support people doing this, and you know, assist people in getting started on it and finding guidance, and particularly for particular subjects. So I think the concept, which I may have committed to at the Rome meeting, was that if we were going to have a training school on this, we'd want people to bring to it a course that they're interested in, a course topic that they're interested in, and we would look at that specific course topic and those like course topics from that everybody brings together and see, okay, how can we build gamification and serious games into these course topics? So it'd be very practical, very hands-on, that people would come out of it with a pretty good idea how to make it work in a particular course in their subject. So hopefully that's those two. Does anybody else have a question? Obviously, you've got the Teams link and you know where to find me, and it's very easy to find me, m.cosgrave@ucc.ie, and I'm contactable through the Game Table network. So if you think of something subsequently, you know, come back and ask. This video, we will clean it up a little bit, and I'll get someone to make sure the sound is okay, and it will appear on the Game Table YouTube. So we will remind everybody when that's there. Do any of you actually get to make your students play games? How do you want to share?
Well, not games, but some, let's say, debates or role playing mostly.
Yes. Yeah. I didn't touch on apart from the Model UN, I didn't touch on role playing. I mean, I use role play mechanics. I use Dungeons and Dragons to explain how people put numbers on characters. I think I said this in Santorini. I can sort of work out what I am like as a role-playing game character. I have really low dexterity. I have a terrible driving skill. Well, I don't have a terrible driving skill, but it's not good. I can't catch anything. So I can put numbers on all of that in terms of what it would be like as a Dungeons and Dragons character. Conversely, I have above average intelligence, but that's not where I actually win out is on research skills, which are better. I'm not that smart actually, but I'm good at research. My Google foo is excellent. This is a mechanic which works. And role play is used a lot, obviously, in early years education and primary education. Primary educators get a grounding in how to use it, which is very good because it is a big part of primary and early years education. Anybody else want to? I do have weeks in my class when we start a discussion going and I say, right, this week, nobody's getting out of the room until everybody contributes to the discussion. I have been known to do that.
That's actually good. That's very good.
It particularly works with grad students. If you get the quiet people in the MA class, you tell them right. And then once you do it, they get used to it and then they all talk and it's fine. I wouldn't do that. Well, maybe. No, I wouldn't do that to all of you.
But I'll contribute because I'm scared. Yes. I do a lot of games in my classes. I think I have a project which is quite similar to what you have shown in your presentation in terms of like cases and scenarios. I'm working with pre-service teachers. So I have this game, I think it's a different genre. It is called epistemic games. The games that are designed for professional learning, and I designed this game for helping pre-service teachers to learn to cope different kind of situations. So we collected data from all over Turkey because it's a kind of a big country. And our students, when they graduate and become teachers, face different kind of situations which are not actually in our teacher education curriculum, but they're not really reflected. So we built cases together with pre-service teachers, in-service teachers, and teacher educators on those difficult kind of situations. We have 10 epistemic game scenarios. Actually, they're quite long. We can play them in 3 hours, but it wasn't very applicable in our courses. So we just, shorted it, and we're now playing them in 1 hour. Most of the time we play them online. So we have the cases, we have some like documents, some tasks that they have to do during the game. And in the end, they have to come up with some kind of a solution to the problem situation, or sometimes just, fill in some tasks that the real teachers have to fill in kind of stuff. At the beginning, in the first prototype, we have 3 prototypes. Actually, we just, change it in every application. At first, we have only kind of negative problematic cases. But when we were collecting data from students, pre-service teachers said that this made them like kind of scared from becoming a teacher. And it's like, we are kind of reflecting only the negative signs, parts of being a teacher. So we added 2 or 3 more positive kind of game scenarios. And I've been using them a lot. And I'm like, work with language teachers a lot in terms of like their master's degree, and they like teaching English in their classrooms, and we use a lot of like cost games, like commercial off-the-shelf games in their classrooms, sometimes out of school experience kind of integration, sometimes directly in the classroom kind of things. These are, I think, 2 basic kinds of games that I'm using for research and for teaching.
Cool. Yeah, the thing about the sort of the original set of games, people being put off by them being so negative, I remember we had a thing, and one of the departments here put in a rule, and other departments copied it very quickly for their postgrad tutors marking essays to avoid negative comments. Before you said negative things, you had to say 3 positive things about the essay. And then you could say the negative things. So you had to try and give the student a bit of a fill up and try and find the positive, because it's very easy to focus on the negative things. So yeah, have you published anything on that, Noor? Have you written papers on that yet? Or is that a thing?
We're actually in writing our first paper out of it. We use the co-design process where different stakeholders were actively involved. So our first publication hopefully will be about the co-design of the game process, and we're just, about to send it to the journals, but we have to have more publications soon. I think, 2 conference publications though.
Yeah, we have the same thing kind of with the chemistry stuff, where we did something and we wrote a paper about it and got 2 things out of that. And then when we do the final year stuff, the undergrads, we'll do another paper on that and keep. But the problem, I mean, it is a big. Some of these are big and complicated things, and you kind of need to pick a slice of them. You're right, and write a paper about how this works. I mean, we didn't write anything about the design process with the pharma companies, but there's clearly a paper in there. It wouldn't necessarily be game related, but it would be something else that we could do at some point in time.
I think they're very useful, and we don't have a lot of like design perspective and papers, and they could be very useful because I was looking for them when I'm trying to design the game, and I was looking for people who are talking about how they did it, and I wasn't able to find a lot. So I think in that sense, that kind of a paper would be very useful.
Yeah, because a lot of the stuff that's written about game design is written about commercial game design, or it's written about digital game design, and we are looking through for giving readings to students. I'm looking through the books and I'm trying to find a chapter that works for giving to students, and it's very difficult to pick out stuff and that will pick a particular aspect and deal with it effectively. It is, but there's more and more appearing, and I think it's going to. I mean, as gamers, as younger people, there are more and more younger people in education at every level who have grown up playing games, and now they're teachers, primary, secondary, university. If you look at some of the literature on educators' literacy about games, which myself and Eleni are looking at with some others to write papers on, or to do a survey on, it's clear that the younger people are doing more of this, which is great, So hopefully there'll be more of it, and we'll have more papers, and that'll be good. It's heading for 6:15, and it's much later in many of your time zones. It's like 7:15 or 8:15 for some of you. If people want to drop out and head away, by all means, don't feel you have to sit here and listen to us talking to one another. But we will certainly keep following up on this, because it is a thing that obviously I have invested a lot of time in it. I know Nur has put a lot of work into it in her courses. Some of the others have as well. Daryl has done a lot of work on gamification. So, it's a thing that we're going to come back to, and hopefully we can maybe get together a training school with some of us, and we can also hopefully, one of the things we said in Rome was that we might write some frameworks. There's a handbook for primary being written, and there was some talk about a secondary, which people are working on. Gerd is working on the primary one, I think, and maybe the secondary, and we should write a 3rd level one, which would take some case studies and put them out there as something that people could use. And obviously, Dorella, you've got your wonderful presentation on gamification, which you're going to publish somewhere as well, aren't you? Which will add to the resources.
Yes, probably.
Yeah, you will. We'll help. If you need us to help you with it, we will. But I'm sure it'll. Yeah, it's a great case study. It'll go out somewhere, or maybe. Yeah, the deadline for European Game-Based Learning Conference was yesterday or the day before, but it's in north of Norway, so I don't think many people are going to that this year. But it'll. It's every year. And there's also, I'm doing a paper. I'm actually doing a version of this at Eurosotl, which is the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning Conference. So there's a big field out there for conferences on teaching and learning, which some of you may be familiar with, which are places to do the conference paper and then turn it into a publication, which is what we all need to do. Okay, so maybe on that note, that we will keep working on and developing this, and us as a group. And I want to thank those of you who were here this evening. I'm so glad that some of you showed up, and you can give me the negative feedback later on in terms and the questions, and we'll keep working on this and developing it. And I think that's probably, no, it's still 6:15. How has the clock not moved on? I don't know. But perhaps at this point we will. Darina, do you want to share with the group what the next webinar is? By way of a bit of promotion.
The next webinar is actually next Friday, and is Elias Turaitis. Let me check exactly the topic. It's on our website, which is good.
It is, the whole list is on the website.
Yes, so that's good. Just let me check.
I don't know if I can make that one because I'm at board game studies.
Oh, next week, you mean?
Next week, it's on all week in Cheminus, which is basically run by people who are actually in the game table action mostly.
So Elias is going to talk about teaching history through digital games, learning challenges and boundaries.
Yeah, I'm going to have to, I can't miss that. I want to see that one. So I'm going to have to, skip some of board game studies in order to see that one. But I'll be joining from a dodgy bar in Cheminetz, probably.
Okay.
Okay.
That will be fun.
We will see you all next week then.
Yeah. See you all next week then. Thank you very, very much, Mike.
There's a question there. Can you tell us about the cost action group? So the cost action group is it's a very large cost action, and what I'll do is I'll put up again the slide. No, I don't want to do that. Give me here. I'll screen share so that you can see the title and the title and the cost action number. Sorry, let me go back here to the start. Oops, where? Oh, I'm having terrible trouble. Yeah, here we go. So it's the cost action is called Game Table. This is from one of our agendas from meeting agenda, but it's got the title and the cost action number is on it there somewhere. Computational techniques for tabletop games. So Game Table for short, and it's listed on the cost action website. So everybody should join a cost action. And if you are not already in it, on the cost website, there's a list of national coordinators in each country, and you contact them and say, can you please put me into this cost action? And they will usually say yes, there's no problem with that. So we are next meeting, we have webinars all the time, and the next meeting for this working group is in September in Belgrade, isn't that right? The other working groups are meeting at different times over the summer. Some of the meetings are online and some of them are hybrid, but what you're looking for is computational techniques for tabletop games heritage.
Yeah. Well, I've put in the chat the actions website.
The actual link, yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
So it's a big group, but it's very welcoming. We have some fun people, and we are making progress on a lot of things. We have a lot of sub projects ongoing, so there's plenty of room for people to become involved. Put as much time as you wish or as little time as you want to in it, and hopefully out of it then, if you're interested in games and games and learning, it also has a hefty section on artificial intelligence in games and using artificial intelligence and cultural heritage games, and there's a lot of computer people there. So it's very unique in that it's bringing the computer scientists and the archaeologists and humanists together, which is really interesting. And hopefully, like all cost actions, we may build other networks out of it in the future.
Yeah.
So it is good. You should come. Yes.
Yes.
Come join us.
Welcome. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Right. Let's leave it at that.
Please do.
Hopefully we'll all be back again next week.
Yes. Let's see each other next week. So bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.